Yeah, yeah. Thanks again, Nicholas, and thanks for having me here today and the opportunity to introduce to you the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard, where I will focus today on explaining you the new requirements as they have come into place as per the 1st of July. But before I go into that, maybe just a few words of introduction about myself. I work as an independent consultant, primarily in the areas of sustainable resources management, certification, and also waste management. I'm based in the Netherlands, and well, I've assisted Bonsucro, the Bonsucro staff, in the past half year or so on drafting the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard, including in the process of getting technical approval from the European Commission. Previously, I also worked on Bonsucro in 2018, where I did a bit of work on the new EU-RED CHOC standard at the time. Well, as I said, today, what I'm going to do is to present to you an overview of the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard, as it has been developed in response to the new EU-RED requirements. And I'll focus on the new and amendment requirements as they apply for mills and supply chain operators as per the 1st of July. In the new Bonsucro EU-RED standards, there's also new requirements for certification bodies and for Bonsucro itself as a scheme owner, as a scheme holder. I will not focus on those requirements yourself. If you're interested in details, obviously, you can all find those in the new Bonsucro standard, which is available from the Bonsucro website. Today, for today's training, the agenda here is as follows. I'll start with a very brief introduction in EU-RED 2, and in particular the relation between EU-RED 2 and Bonsucro and the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. I'll then go a bit into the scope of the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. And then in item 3, 4, and 5 of the agenda, I'll get into a bit more detail on the changes in requirements in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard for mills, for supply chain operators, and more in particular, greenhouse gas requirements that apply to both mills and supply chain operators. And I hope that at the time, well, at the end of the session, we have some time for questions and answers as well. So then, let's start with the first item, EU-RED 2 and Bonsucro. Well, most of you are probably familiar with the first EU Renewable Directive, which was published and came into place in 2009. That Renewable Energy Directive includes sustainability requirements for biofuels and bioliquids placed on the European market. In that directive, a system was introduced whereby operators who supply biofuels and bioliquids to the European market can use voluntary schemes, can use certification schemes to show compliance with the sustainability requirements in that EU Renewable Energy Directive. Well, in response to the EU, to that first RED, RED 1, as it is the abbreviation, Bonsucro was recognized as one of those voluntary schemes, as one of those certification schemes that could be used to show compliance with the sustainability requirements in RED 1. Bonsucro was first recognized in 2011 and again in 2017, both times for a period of 5 years. Then in 2018, European Commission published a new Renewable Energy Directive, generally referred to as RED 2. And that Renewable Energy Directive, well, has large comparisons with RED 1, so with the first Renewable Energy Directive, but it also includes additional requirements. And amongst those additional requirements are additional sustainability requirements for biofuels and for bioliquids. And in addition to that, EU Renewable RED 2 also introduces sustainability requirements for biomass fuels. I will just highlight the definitions for those three types of fuels in a minute. So the fact that RED 2 includes new sustainability requirements, additional sustainability requirements for biofuels, biofuels, means that the voluntary schemes, which can be used to show compliance with the sustainability requirements, have to be amended. They have to be amended to include also the additional sustainability requirements, so that under RED 2 they can still be used to show compliance with the sustainability requirements in the European legislation in RED 2. In other words, this means that voluntary schemes such as Bonsucro have had to be updated, have to be amended. The scheme documentations have to be amended to include the additional requirements from this new RED 2 legislation, and then those new scheme documents have to be reapproved by the European Commission for being allowed to be used in the next years also. Well, in response to RED 2 and its requirements, Bonsucro has taken the initiative to develop a new Bonsucro EU-RED standard in order to meet all the requirements, both the existing requirements and the new requirements in RED 2. That Bonsucro EU-RED standard was developed starting last year and earlier this year, and in a, let's say, a process with the European Commission. Bonsucro finally achieved, as one of the first schemes, it has to be said, as one of the first schemes, it achieved technical approval by the European Commission in last month, June. This means that Bonsucro EU-RED standard, the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard, can be used to show compliance with the RED 2 sustainability requirements. It can be used as per the 1st of July 2021. It also means that references in the Bonsucro scheme documentation to RED 1 are no longer valid. So all relevant requirements to show compliance with RED 2 legislations are now in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. This is very important. I will come back to this in a minute in one of my next slides. So this is good news that the Bonsucro EU-RED standard can be used to show compliance. It is a bit difficult in the sense that it is work by the Commission, in particular the approval process done by the Commission was, let's say, a little bit last minute, so that now all of a sudden US operators, either mills or supply chain operators, you have to comply with these new requirements as per 1st of July. But I think it's good, and Bonsucro can be proud and can be glad that it has been approved before the 1st of July. That's good news. Well, just one remark here at the bottom of the slides. This is not the end of the process with the European Commission. In the next months, probably sometime September, the European Commission will publish what they call an implementing act. And that implementing act is a piece of legislation which contains further details on the sustainability requirements. So basically what the implementing act contains is more details in relation to the RED 2 sustainability requirements. For example, some more details on how greenhouse gas calculations have to be done. Some more details on other sustainability requirements. This implementing act is now up for consultation. After that consultation, it will be finalized, and as I said, it's likely to be published sometime in September, maybe a bit later, but currently it's expected in September. What then is required, once it has been finalized, that the Bonsucro EU-RED standard needs to be amended further by Bonsucro, basically to include all the further details from the implementing act, and then it has to be resubmitted again to the European Commission for them to assess the standard, including all the additional details, and then it has to be approved again. And only after that approval, Bonsucro will get a, let's say, a final approval for a period of 5 years. Well, that's something, as I said, which will happen over the next month. For today, obviously, the contents of the implementing act are not yet considered, simply because it's not yet final and it hasn't been included yet in the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. But I'm mentioning this to you so that you have a total overview of where we stand in this whole process with the European Commission. It's a process, unfortunately, on which Bonsucro has, let's say, little influence, and really the timelines that are being used and the dates of publications, we really have to await what the Commission, European Commission, comes up with. Well, I mentioned this already, but this is very important. So in response to the new EU-RED requirements, to the RED II requirements, Bonsucro has developed a Bonsucro EU-RED standard, which basically is a standalone document, a standard which comes on top of the Bonsucro production standard, on top of the chain of custody standard, and on top of the certification protocol and of other documents and guidelines and interpretation notes and so on, which Bonsucro has. The fact that now all RED II requirements are in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard also means that a number of requirements, as you probably know them, in existing Bonsucro standards, they do no longer apply. More particularly, Principle 6 of the Bonsucro production standard, version 4.2, is specifically for mills wanting to comply with EU-RED I requirements, so that principle no longer applies. Secondly, there is a separate standard, there was a separate standard, which is called the Bonsucro EU-RED mass balance chain of custody standard, version 5.1. Also, that version no longer applies, since all the requirements from that standard have now been included in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. And the same applies to the reference in the Bonsucro certification protocol, version 5. So what I'll focus on today is what difference there are between, let's say, the 3 previous standards which you knew in the 3 bullets here, compared to the requirements which are in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. Well, as I said, the Bonsucro EU-RED standard is a standalone document, and this is sort of the general contents of that document. So you find it on the Bonsucro website, and I really would recommend you, if you haven't done so yet, to study this document in addition to this training. I mean, I'm trying to explain a variety of aspects of the standard today, but obviously it's not, let's say, 100% the contents of the standard, which I'm telling today. So for all details, for full details, please, in addition to this training, also read this standard in full. And then coming to the second point on the agenda, which is on the scope of the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. The previous RED 1 and also Bonsucro EU-RED covered 2 types of biofuels. It covered bioliquids and biofuels. Now, RED II covers an additional category of fuels, which are biomass fuels, meaning that also the Bonsucro EU-RED standard now covers 3 types of fuels: bioliquids, which are liquid fuels used for energy purposes other than for transport, in particular electricity, heating and cooling, fuels made from biomass. Biofuels, as you know, are the liquid fuels for transport, used from biogas. And then there's biomass fuels, which are either gaseous or solid fuels produced from biogas. And in particular, and in the case of sugarcane, that would primarily relate to bagasse pellets or bagasse briquettes and like products. Well, the Bonsucro EU-RED standard, as previously, it covers the cultivation and processing of sugarcane to produce those 4 types of main categories of products, you might say, whereby in particular the 4th category, so the solid biomass fuels produced from bagasse, are a new category which can now be covered under EU-RED standard. In other words, if a mill, if a supply chain complies with the Bonsucro EU-RED standard, it would be allowed to supply those 4 types of products on the European market for the different applications which were mentioned in the previous slides. Agricultural residues from sugarcane cultivation, such as leaves, tops, whatever agricultural residues really, are not in the scope. Neither are processing waste and processing residues, with the exception of bagasse, which is included in the scope. I mentioned this already. And thereby, it's important to mention that under the definitions of RED II, bagasse is considered by the European Commission a processing residue and not an agricultural residue. I obviously realize that there is different ways of looking at bagasse. You might say it's processing or it's agricultural, but keep in mind that under RED II definitions, it's considered a processing residue. And in effect, that is not a bad thing, because that means that it has to meet less sustainability requirements than in the case that it would be qualified as that it would be defined as an agricultural residue. So that's in relation to generally on the scope of the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. Also, for further details, please look in the full standard for the full text. I'd then like to move to the changes in the requirements for mills. And on this slide, you will find the summary of the sustainability requirements that apply to mills under the new RED II requirements and in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. And you probably will find, those of you who were aware already with the previous requirements, in particular with Principle 6 of the Bonsucro Production Standard version 4.2, that there is large similarity between sort of the main categories of sustainability requirements for mills. The new requirements listed here versus the old requirements. I'll leave the first requirement in relation to greenhouse gases for the moment. You've seen that is on point 5 of the agenda. I'll deal with greenhouse gases in a separate agenda item, both for mills and supply chain operators. I'll now, in the next few slides, go a bit into the land use requirements, which are listed here under the 3 main bullets. One thing I'd like to highlight also in this slide is that in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard, we have used a new numbering, new numbering really of indicators. And indicators have been listed, starting all indicators with EU, referring to the fact that it is an indicator specifically meant to comply with EU-RED requirements, and then starting with indicator 1.1, and as you see here, 2.1, 3, 4, and then for supply chain requirements, it goes on with indicator 5 and 6 and so on. I'll now go through the indicators in some more detail. I won't go through all the indicators in detail. I'll focus on the changes in the new standard compared to the requirements in the old standard. First of all, requirements are related to the conservation of biodiversity, and that is so that's listed here. So basically, the requirement in the EU is that biofuels, bioliquids produced from agricultural biomass shall not be made from raw materials obtained with high biodiversity value in January 2008. Well, that sort of general principle hasn't changed. There is 4 indicators under that general principle, briefly summarized here. You can, of course, again read the full indicators in the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. 2 indicators haven't changed, indicator 2.1 and 2.3, and there's 2 indicators, 2.2 and 2.4, where there has been a definition. And I'm highlighting these requirements. Well, the first indicator 2.2, that's a new requirement, whereby it says that highly biodiverse forest or other wooded land, well, biomass shall not be taken from those types of land, whereby the definitions, what is meant by highly biodiverse and species rich, have been included in section 2 of the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. The second indicator, which is not new, but which has changed a bit, is indicator 2.4 on highly biodiverse grassland. As I said, it's not a new requirement. However, this requirement, this indicator has been made a bit more specific. The requirement now references a specific EU regulation, the number of which is mentioned here on these slides. And that EU regulation that includes guidance in relation to, well, this requirement on highly biodiverse grassland. So in other words, it makes it more specific, and the requirements in that regulation shall be taken into account when a piece of land is assessed against this indicator 2.4. Again, the Bonsucro EU-RED standard contains more explanation on what this regulation includes and what a mill should look at and what an auditor also should look at. The second category of requirements under these land use requirements for mills are in relation to conservation of carbon stocks. There's 3 indicators on carbon stocks, on wetlands, on continuously forested areas, and on forested land with 10 to 30% canopy cover. Indicator 3.2 is identical to the indicator which was previously included in the EU-RED requirements, and indicator 3.1 and 3.3 have changed somewhat. Although limited, I have to say. In indicator 3.1, which is about wetlands, basically what has changed is that the requirements now specifically says that in verifying compliance with this requirement, it should also reflect seasonal changes in water levels within a year. So that's not a new requirement, it's basically the same requirement, but it's a bit more, has been made a bit more specific what is exactly requested. Well, the same, you might say, or well, comparable applies to indicator 3.3. Also, this is not a new requirement. It's an existing requirement. This was in place already, and also in place was the text, which is listed here under the Bols indicator text, which says that it's only allowed to use biomass from forested land with 10 to 30% canopy cover. It's only allowed to use biomass from such land if it is proven that the greenhouse gas criterion is still fulfilled. In other words, you have to take into account the sort of the carbon stock change which is taking place when converting such land to land for production of sugarcane. That was in there already. That's not a new thing. What is new in this requirement is that for this requirement, the new greenhouse gas methodology shall be used. So not the old greenhouse gas methodology, which you're used to, but new greenhouse gas methodology. As I said, I come back to the greenhouse gas methodology later in this presentation. So again, that's a pretty limited, pretty limited change to the requirement, I would say. And then finally, in the land use criteria, there is obviously the indicator on peatland, and that indicator has that was there already. It's not a new indicator, but this indicator has been clarified in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. Basically saying that for peatland that was partially drained, a deeper drainage affecting soil that was not fully drained would constitute a breach of the criteria. Again, this is not a new requirement, but a more of a clarification of the existing requirement. So all in all, I think it's fair to say that the land use requirements for mills, as they are now, as they are under the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard, are largely for a really significant part the same as the requirements as they were in the previous standard under RED 1, with the exception of the changes which I just showed you, and which in most cases comprise, let's say, a further explanation of a requirement rather than a new requirement, or rather than a stricter requirement. From there on, having talked about the changes in requirements for mills, with the exception of the greenhouse gas requirement, as I said, which we'll come back to later, I'm now moving into the changes in requirements for supply chain operators. Requirements for supply chain operators have been included in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard, and those requirements can be divided into three main categories. General mass balance requirements, those are 7 indicators, 5.1 to 5.7. Then requirements in relation to validating and reconciling Bonsucro EU-RED data. There's 10 indicators listed under indicator 6, 1 to 6.10. And then there's greenhouse gas emission savings, which are under indicator EU 7.1. So this is the summary. I'll, again, as I did with the requirements for mills, I'll also here take you through all the requirements, but I'll focus only on details which have been changed in some of the indicators. And I hope that you'll find with me that the changes to the requirements are, let's say, relatively limited. And then what I mean is the changes compared to the old Bonsucro EU-RED CHOC standard. So the change between the old Bonsucro EU-RED CHOC standard and the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard are relatively limited. But let me show you that first. So here are the indicators related to the general mass balance requirements. So there's 7, and there's basically changes to two indicators, indicator 5.3 and 5.6. And those new indicators are listed here on this slide. The main change, you might say, is on indicator 5.3. It's about reporting to the European Commission. Well, this requirement basically says it directly came from EU-RED 2. It directly came from the Commission, and Bonsucro had to include this in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. It says that economic operators shall enter all requested information in relation to Bonsucro certified material that they purchase, that they supply. They shall enter all that requested information in the European Union database as soon as the database starts operation. Well, this has been included in the Bonsucro EU-RED standard, but the reality is that today this database is not yet existing. It's not yet operational, and Bonsucro and also other voluntary schemes do at this stage not exactly know what will be the contents of that database and what exactly the European Commission will ask you to enter in that database. So to be honest, at this stage, it's really a bit guessing of what this union database will contain. It will be, obviously, it will be related to volumes of certified products that are being traded and that are being put on the European market. But how exactly that shall be done is uncertain at this stage. Obviously, as soon as Bonsucro receives more details about the database and as soon as it becomes operational, Bonsucro will communicate that information to you and also additional guidance on how you as operator should deal with that union database. So it's a new requirement, but not something which has implications currently. It's something which well, has no practical implications for your business right now. Then the second change is related to both indicator 5.3 and 5.6. That's not, well, you might say it's not a change really. What is the case here is that certain texts that were previously in the guidance section, so that were guidance in the old Bonsucro EU-RED CHOC standard, those guidance sections have now been included in the indicators itself. In other words, they have become mandatory. And that is because that was a requirement from the European Commission to do that. So the guidance text is now in the indicator text itself. You'll find that when you read the Bonsucro EU-RED standard in detail. The second set of the EU-RED requirements specifically for the for supply chain operators is related to validating and reconciling Bonsucro EU-RED data. There are 10 indicators, as you see here on the slide, and there's changes to 5 of those indicators compared to the old Bonsucro EU-RED CHOC standard. I'll go through them right now. Yeah, both on the indicator 6.2, which is on the verification of data of the incoming certified product, so the material which a supply chain operator receives, and on indicator EU 6.5, which is about the material which a supply chain operator supplies. There is both on those indicators, there is 2 changes compared to the previous, the old indicators. First of all, the greenhouse gas information that is supplied in the supply chain, that is transferred after the supply chain, shall be based on the new greenhouse gas requirements, on the RED 2 greenhouse gas requirements. might say, well, that's actually pretty obvious, of course, that shall not be based on the old greenhouse gas requirements, but rather on the new greenhouse gas requirements. But I'm listing it here still because it's important to supply the correct information through the supply chain, even if it's just the default values. The second thing which has changed for both indicator 6.2 and 6.5 is that under this requirement, additional information shall be provided on support which has been received for the production of the material, including details on the type of support scheme. In other words, if there is subsidies, in particular if there's EU subsidies or subsidies from member states for the production of sugarcane or sugar-derived products. I don't know how likely that is, but if that is the case, then information on that kind of support shall be included in the documentation which accompanies the material through the supply chain, so on the notes or the other documentation which is transferred. So those are let's say the real changes to 6.2 and 6.5, and then again, as in the previous one of the previous slides, also under indicator 6.1, 6.2, 6.5, and 6.9, there are certain texts that previously in the old Bonsucro EU-RED CHOC standard for guidance are now included in the indicators itself. In other words, those requirements have become mandatory. They are no longer guidance, they are now in the indicators. Then the last one, and that was that's on indicator 6.10. Again, it's not a it's not a new requirement. Yeah, it was in the old Bonsucro EU-RED CHOC standard as well, but it was listed not in that standard, not as a requirement, but rather as a bit of guidance. And this is now listed as a new requirement. Basically, it says that EU-RED certified product can only be carried over to the next inventory period if the equivalent physical volume is in stock. This is a bit different from the, let's say, the generic Bonsucro CHOC standard, where volumes can be carried over even if there's no equivalent physical volume in stock at that time. So again, not a new requirement, but a new requirement listed as a new indicator, but it was in let's say the old Bonsucro EU-RED CHOC standard already. I hope that you find, as with the requirements for mills, that, as I said, also the changes in the requirements for Bonsucro certified supply chain operators are relatively limited compared to the requirements that were in the old Bonsucro EU-RED CHOC standard. Now, then, as the third of the three, let's say, changes in requirements, I want to talk a bit about the changes in the greenhouse gas requirements in RED 2 and consequently also in the new Bonsucro EU-RED standard. First, in general, in the previous slides, you have probably noticed that greenhouse gas requirements for mills, the general greenhouse gas requirement for mills is listed in indicator EU 1.1 and for the supply chain in the indicator EU 7.1. And in both those indicators, it is specified, let's say, in more or less generic terms, that mills and supply chain operators shall use one of the following options for the greenhouse gas criterion for biofuels, bioliquids, and biomass fuels. They shall either use the default value, shall use an actual greenhouse gas value to calculate the total greenhouse gas savings, or as the third option, shall use a combination of disaggregated default values and actual values to calculate total greenhouse gas. Well, those three options are the same as they were in RED 1. So you can still use one of those three options. What is important, and what I'm going to briefly show you in the next slide, is that there have been changes been made to default values, first of all. So default values in RED 2 are slightly different than the default values under RED 1. The second thing which has changed is that there is changes in the methodology, details of the methodology which must be used to do actual greenhouse gas calculations. I'm going to tell you a bit about that. First, on the issue of the changed default values. What is important to realize, first of all, is that in EU-RED 2, there is two sets of default values and also two greenhouse gas calculation methodologies. One of which is for biofuels and bioliquids, and one is for biomass fuels. There is two annexes in the RED 2 which refer to default values and to greenhouse gas calculation methodology. Annex 5 of RED 2 is related to biofuels and bioliquids, and Annex 6 is related to biomass fuels. Please keep this in mind. I mean, it's RED 2, it's a complex document with a lot of information, so make sure that if you're going to dig into one of these two annexes, that you take the correct annex, which is applicable to you. They look very similar at first sight, but really, it's important to make sure you get the right one for the purpose of what you're dealing with. Moving back to default values. As I said, the default values for bioethanol from sugarcane, they have been slightly amended by the European Commission. So they have been amended in RED 2 compared to the default values listed in RED 1. So they are slightly higher now, which you find here. I've listed here both the overall default value, which is now 28.6, compared to 24 previously, and then I've also listed the disaggregated default values for cultivation, processing, and transport and distribution. What is important, so if you use default values, that as per the 1st of July, if you supply product including including greenhouse gas information based on its default value, that you use this new default value. So for all new basically supply of EU-RED certified material, as per 1st of July, this new default value shall be used and no longer the old default value. So these are so basically this is an existing default value which has been changed. Then in the new EU-RED, so in Annex 6, which is about biomass fuel, so in Annex 6 of EU-RED, there is also a totally new default value for bagasse briquettes as to be used as biomass fuel. And there's two overall default values for bagasse briquette. One is 6 grams CO2 and then 10, the other one is 10. And depending on the transport distance, which is of the bagasse briquettes to its final use, you can either use the lower value, or you need to use the higher value. And then also in Annex 6, there is disaggregated default values also for the rest of the cats. So those are the default values that must be used as per the 1st of July of this year. What is important, and this is not a new requirement, but but I'd like to emphasize this because it is important, and it's one where the Commission is very critical, is that all the listed default values, all the default values which I showed you on the previous slides, can only be used if the emissions from land use change are less or equal to 0. If emissions to land use change are more than 0, the greenhouse gas emissions from that land use change must be added to the default value. And then you may ask, like, well, how do I calculate those emissions from land use change? Well, for that, you have to go into the greenhouse gas calculation methodology. In the greenhouse gas calculation methodology, there is a number of greenhouse gas emission factors that need to be taken into account. And one of those emission factor is a factor called EL, which is the emission related to land use change. And if there is emissions related to land use change, you need to calculate those emissions according to the methodology laid out in that annex, and then add that up to the default values. That's all explained in more detail in Annex 5 and 6 of the EU-RED, but it's also detailed in Annex 1 of the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. So, as I said, there is 2 annexes in RED 2. Annex 5 is related to biofuels and bioliquids. Annex 6 is related to biomass fuels. And the contents of those 2, well, let's say the contents of a large part of Annex 5 and 6 have been included also in Annex 1 of the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. So Bonsucro EU-RED standard contains one pretty, let's say, large, extensive annex. And that annex is about greenhouse gas calculations. And the contents of that annex are listed here in green. So it's about general requirements. And then part 3 is about the methodology to calculate greenhouse gas emissions for biofuels and bioliquids. And then part 4 of that annex is about calculation of greenhouse gas emissions from biomass fuels. In relation to the greenhouse gas calculation methodology, in general terms, the greenhouse gas calculation methodology has changed somewhat compared to the greenhouse gas methodology that you are used to. That was listed in EU-RED 1, and that was also further detailed in the Biograce tool. Unfortunately, really unfortunately, the Biograce tool has not been updated to comply with RED 2 greenhouse gas calculation requirements, meaning that the Biograce tool does not comply with RED 2 requirements. And this means that the Biograce tool is no longer valid and can no longer be used. I've heard that there is no plans at this stage to update the Biograce tool to make it compliant with RED 2 requirements. In other words, well, so that's unfortunate that the Biograce tool can no longer be used, and it means that operators who do not or cannot use default values, but instead want to do actual greenhouse gas calculations, that they must develop their own tool. And that can be, well, the tool can basically have any form and shape. It can be Excel based or anything else, as long as it complies with the calculation methodology as specified in EU-RED 2 and specified also in Annex 1 of the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. And that obviously, to check if that's the case, is then up to the auditor to do that. The auditor will then have to check whether the tool which has been developed by an operator complies with all the requirements. Well, the good news maybe is that when developing such own tool, certain data and certain factors, basic emission factors and so on, which haven't changed from the Biograce tool, may still be used. So that if you develop your own tool, you do not totally have to, let's say, reinvent the wheel, so to say. But again, I have to say it's unfortunate that this tool is no longer there, and well, it might be worth, if there is a need in the sugarcane sector amongst yourselves to have sort of an alternative tool. It's something which you might consider to develop to basically facilitate the market, and also to make probably let's say verifications of greenhouse gas calculations by auditors a bit easier, because obviously it will be a bit more complex for auditors to verify actual greenhouse calculations based on own tools than verified calculations based on the Biograce. Then moving to the greenhouse gas calculation methodology. On this slide, you'll see the old calculation formula for biofuels and for bioliquids. I forgot to put that on the slide, but it's the formula for biofuels and bioliquids. And then the new calculation formula for biofuels and bioliquids. And it's basically, you'll see the main difference straight away on this side. Emission savings from carbon capture and geological storage, two factors, CCS and CCR, they can no longer be applied. I think they were in the first place not really relevant for, let's say, sugarcane to biofuels, but they have now been explicitly included from the formula. And the last one, which is emission savings from excess electricity, which used to be in the formula, has been skipped from the new calculation methodology, so that factor can no longer be taken into account as well. So those are, let's say, two main changes, you might say, from the old calculation formula to the new calculation formula. I think what is more important is that for some of the factors here, so for the existing greenhouse gas emission factors in the new formula, so EEC, EL, EP, etc., there are changes in the details of how these emission factors shall be calculated. It would be a bit too much and too detailed to deal with that here today. This training, it's not, let's say, crucially different, but it is in the details rather. So really, if you start working with the new calculation formula, please make sure that you read the Annex 1 of the Bonsucro EU-RED standard carefully, in particular part 3 and 4, where all the details of the calculation methodologies have been laid down. So it's really not fundamentally different. The outcomes also will be pretty much comparable, I'm sure, but there is some let's say, devils in the details of doing the calculation. Well, then, in addition to this calculation methodology, which is on biofuels and bioliquids, there is the new calculation methodology in RED 2, and which is the calculation methodology for biomass fuels. As I said, biomass fuels are new in RED 2, and so is the greenhouse gas calculation methodology for those a biomass fuel. So in case you do not wish or you cannot use a default value for biomass fuels, this is the calculation formula for biomass fuel. And you'll find, if you look at it, that it is pretty much, let's say, comparable to the calculation formula for biofuels and bioliquids, with the exception of the factor EU here. And those EU stands for emissions that results from the use of the biomass fuel. So basically greenhouse gas emissions other than CO2, which arise when the biomass fuel, so in other words, when the bagasse briquettes or the bagasse pellets are being burned in a power plant. In certain power plants, there might not only be CO2 emissions from the burning process, there might also be some emissions of methane or nitrogen oxide arising. Well, I guess I think there's no energy producers, as far as I know, in this meeting. So in that case, that well, the factor is not relevant to you. It's only relevant really to the power plant, which is using bagasse briquettes, gas pellets, and who has to do the total greenhouse gas calculations, including this factor, this new factor EU. Again, for the full details, please look at Annex 1, Part 4, where the methodology is spelled out in all detail. Well, then this, I mentioned this already. As I said, for the separate greenhouse gas emission factors, they haven't changed fundamentally in the new greenhouse gas methodology. However, there are a number of primarily minor changes in the calculation methodology. So please, if you look at that calculation methodology and if you're developing your tool, or if you're developing your tool to do this actual greenhouse gas calculation, make sure that you take note of all the details in Annex 1 of the Bonsucro standard. Well, that was my last slide in relation to the, well, explaining to you or providing an overview rather of the new requirements versus the old requirements for mills, supply chain operators, and also on greenhouse gas requirements. I'm looking at the time. It's, I think we have some time left for question and answers, I think, Nicholas. Am I right?
Yes, indeed. And there's been a lot of questions on the Q&A session, and I thank everyone for your question. We've answered a lot of them as you were speaking. So hopefully that has clarified some of the points. Some I was in time of reviewing them. But I just wanted to highlight 2 points that were important and from the question that were asked. Those requirements that Arjen just presented needs to be met by every certified operators exporting ethanol to Europe from the 1st of July. So even if you had your audit just before the 1st of July, from the 1st of, and that audit was against the old EU requirement, from the 1st of July, you have to implement and comply with the new requirement. In that process, we have shared with you on the 30th of June a letter that we ask you to fill in and to sign and to send us back. This letter is a mechanism that we've developed under the interpretation of the rules by the European Commission that say that we need to ensure that all certified members commit to implement the new requirement by the 1st of July. So we ask you to declare that you are complying with those new requirements from the 1st of July. If you haven't signed that letter, if you haven't seen that letter, please come to us, inform us immediately so we can resend it to you. So it's important that from now you look at precisely the EU-RED standards that we've published, and that you understand the requirement and that you implement the requirement and you follow the requirement, especially when you do shipments towards European Union. The second point is the change into the default value. This is important. It's changing from 24 grams of CO2 per megajoule to 28.6 grams of CO2 per megajoule. This is important that if you are using the default value in your documents, shipment documents toward your clients, that you use from now on this default value. That is a point that will be checked as well by your clients, but as well by the member state when receiving the shipments. So it's important to look at that. If you are using actual calculation, you need to update your methodology of calculation. As Arjen said, Biograce tool is no more valid. If you have access to the Biograce tool, you can update it yourself according to the new calculation methodology, or you have to develop your own way of doing actual calculation. The Bonsucro calculator is not a tool to do actual calculation. The Bonsucro calculator is only used for default value plus land use change. That's all, default value and land use change. It doesn't provide you with an actual calculation of greenhouse gas emission. So if you want to use the actual calculation methodology, you have to do the calculation yourself and use that as information provided to your supply chain. We will update as well, and thank you for those comments around what is the limit that can be exceeded in terms of GHG emission, or what is the minimum saving that the shipment of ethanol has to reach. So there is different level. There is 5 levels in the legislation according to the date of operation of the production of ethanol. So from when the producer came into line, and those requirements span from 50% reduction to 75% reduction according to the date, and we will update, but we have to provide that clarity so it's clearly in front of our members. So that was the point I had in mind.
Can I add something to that, Nicholas?
Yes,
thanks for that addition. I'm not sure whether you shared that. What we did, maybe it's good to mention, is that we made a table. Which lists basically the changes. Well, which lists all the indicators. So basically all the new EU-RED indicators which are applicable, and also in the table indicates where there is changes. So in other words, I think it's very handy sort of instrumental, if you like, to check where which possible changes are applicable to you. And as I said, I think they are relatively limited for mills, relatively limited for supply chain operators, but I think it's good to check that against that table. Using that table, also read the full EU-RED standard, as I said, just to make sure you're aware of all the details. Once you have done that, you can submit the letter, and you can also then, and then still applies what Nicholas says, that in every shipment you shall use the new default values, or the new basically actual values if you use those.
Yes, and all this information is on the website, Bonsucro website, so you can download as well the summary of changes. So I'm trying to look at question on the biomass feedstock. That would be the pellets of bagasse that I use for which are burnt to produce electricity. So for the land use change, the criteria, but the methodology used to evaluate land use change emission hasn't changed, and you can still use the one provided in the calculator tab P6 that identify the different category or nature of land use change, and ask you to fill in some information on carbon stock, land use factor, management factor, input factor. and give you the changes in gram per CO2 per megajoule per year, to which you add to the default value. This can still be used.
Yeah, whereby it is important that you use, so that needs to be in the calculator, need to be added up to the default values, that you use the new default values, and then add up the land use change calculation to that.
Now there is a question if the reference value for fossil fuel has changed or not. Is it still 89.9 or is it?
I am not sure, to be honest. I think it might have changed, but it's no, I would have to look that. I would have to look that up.
Yeah. So we will come back to you on this.
Those are a good questions, but there might be more of those sort of details, and that's why really it's difficult for anyone to have those all in top of mind. But it's important to check in the details of the RED 2 and the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. Yeah.
So we have as well put on the website the link to the legislation itself, so you can click and look at the legislation itself, and it's available in various languages, in all the European languages, including Spanish and Portuguese. So you will be able as well to go in the detail of the legislation if required. So that we answered on the default values. The default value is 28.6 now for liquid ethanol. The question of carryover has come several times. Just to remind that in the EU system, you can carry over a volume of ethanol feedstock into the next period only if you have the equivalent volume in stock. Only if you have the equivalent volume in stock. And this is different from the Bonsucro normal system, where you can carry over without equivalent volume in stock. So for the EU system, you must have the equivalent volume in stock to be able to carry over to the next period. And this hasn't changed with the new EU-RED. That was the same as well with previous EU-RED and this EU-RED. So this is an ongoing rule for Bonsucro. So check that. Sure. Then there is some comment in Portuguese, and I'm afraid sometimes not to make the right translation. So I will focus on the English one for the moment. So that we've answered. Virginia Pragana, I'm not sure about your question. A mudança de uso do solo será desmatamento zero igual outras normas.
The change in the use of soil is like a deforestation zero?
I will let Arjen to explain further to make sure I interpret correctly the requirements on deforestation. How does EU-RED address the question of deforestation, the requirement linked to land use change from forest?
Yeah, well, it's a broad question. So there is, as explained, and I just have to look them up. So there's different requirements related to land use and to land use change. And basically, there's a couple of indicators. So there's different indicators which actually, you might say, deal with the issue of land use change. So basically, there is a couple of indicators which basically say that biofuels, bioliquids, biomass cannot be produced from land that was that had a high biodiversity value in January 2008. That's the reference data. So that's primary forest cannot be made from land that was primary forest 2008 or later, not highly biodiverse forest protected areas. And then there is also requirements, of course, in relation to carbon stocks. Those are the so that it cannot be made from forested land with. I'm just looking here at requirements. It's so not made from continuously forested area or forested land even with 10 to 30% canopy cover. So really there is, so there's not, in other words, there's not one indicator which deals with forest conversion or prohibition of forest conversion. There's a number of indicators related to conversion of land to produce biofuels, rather to produce sugarcane in this instance. And those are related to certain land types which have either high biodiversity value, forests with high biodiversity value, or forests with certain high carbon stocks. So it really, for details, really, I mean, I can read the indicators, but as I said, there's a couple, really read the indicators under indicator, let's say, 2.1 to, looking here, 2.1 to 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and then also indicator 3.2 and 3.3. Those all deals with forest to agricultural land, when that is allowed and when it's prohibited.
Thank you, Arjen. The other question was about if Bonsucro, I would put it in the Bonsucro EU context, accept measures to reduce emissions to compensate any emissions from production or land use change. Is it allowed? Can we include those compensation measures into the greenhouse gas emission calculation, or are they excluded?
That's a very good one. So if I understand you right, that's a practice of better agricultural management, rather. And this is this is an aspect where there is some details in the current methodology, but where I've seen that the implementing act, which I mentioned, which is due for publication in the coming months, in relation to better agricultural practices and greenhouse gas reductions from those practices, which may be taken into account. That implementing act will contain much more details on that. And I think that will also contain details in relation to measures such as application of compost or mulches and so on. So they are currently not yet in the methodology. That's the short answer. They have not yet been detailed in the current methodology, but the implementing act will contain more details. And once the implementing act has been included in the Bonsucro EU-RED standard and in the Bonsucro EU-RED greenhouse gas calculation methodology, after that, it can be used as a factor.
Thank you. Sorry, the sun has come out. So in general, as for you and as for us, this is a new legislation. So we are as well, and we have to be transparent as well, learning as we go. And your question are extremely valuable because they help us to collect that knowledge and to capture that knowledge. So as we receive questions from members, we are gathering them into a document that will form a Q&A that we will publish in the coming weeks. I can't say next week, but maybe in two or 3 weeks once we have tidied up the document. So all your questions will be there and you'll be able to find consistent answers to those questions. Some we don't have the answer yet because we are as well evaluating them or investigating them. Some we have, and we'll provide them, like have a better visibility on the threshold of GHG emissions according to the year of operation for the production of ethanol. The other point that is important to note is that, as Arjen mentioned at the start, the EU is going to produce an implementation act, which is in fact open for public consultation on the EU website. This implementation act contain additional requirements that we will have to include into the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. Meaning in the coming months, we will have to publish a new version of the EU-RED requirements, and you will have to implement with, we don't know which timeline will be given, or you will be given by the European Commission, but you will have as well to comply with additional requirements as and when they are published by the European Commission. We know this is not an adequate situation. We have reported, and other schemes like Bonsucro have reported that to the European Commission, and we continue to work with the European Commission for them to better understand the challenge of the economic operators in managing changing regulation. We do our best to support you, and we hope we will find solutions that are agreeable for everyone. Is to prepare the fact that new requirements are likely to come into line in the next couple of months. So I've got a question around the compensation coming from deforestation. I will separate this discussion, which might be a Bonsucro discussion versus a Bonsucro EU discussion. The Bonsucro EU discussion is tied a lot and exclusively tied to the requirement of the European Directive on renewable energy. So it's not something that is part of our day-to-day work as an organization supporting the sugarcane sector. Is a mechanism to facilitate demonstration of compliance with the legislation.
Yeah, whereby Bonsucro basically has 0 degrees of freedom to choose whether you would accept EU-RED requirements. It's well, either full acceptance or non-compliance, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And we have committed to our members to maintain our EU-RED compliance, and the publication of the EU-RED document last 2 weeks ago, and now this training and our ongoing support to our members. As there is no more question coming up that we haven't answered yet, or for which we have a clear answer, the remaining question about the threshold, and we want to calculate them before communicate them to everyone, so we give you an exact information. I will leave it open for another 1 or 2 minutes for last requests. We are always available by email, of course. Your regional directors as well are present. If you want to discuss with them, your certification body are key support to all our certified members. They are as well here to support you and to help you. So on this, I would like to thank you, Arjen, very much for all your support in the process of adapting and adopting the EU-RED requirement with the Bonsucro standards. And we will share the presentation in English online. We will share the recording in the 3 languages available, Spanish, English, and Portuguese, on the website as well, by the end of the week or early next week. The documents are as well, the legislation and the standard and the summary of change are as well available online. And we are always available for questions. If you have, don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you to Esperanza, Clay, and Celia for your translation. That has helped a lot our members to receive the message in their own language. And I wish you all a good end of day, and see you very soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yep. All right.